It was a Thursday night in November, and the rain came down on Abercorn without any warning. The sky had been flat gray all afternoon, and then, in about 3 minutes, it went white. I was walking out of the hardware store when I saw her standing under the overhang by the door. Grace. One arm around a paper bag, no umbrella, no car in that lot that belonged to her. She had walked there. 6 months. That was how long it had been since I'd seen her. I pulled the truck up and rolled the window down. "Get in. I'll drive you home." She didn't say anything. She opened the door and got in. 10 minutes of driving, and neither one of us said a word. Just the rain on the roof and the wipers going. At her house, I shut the engine off, went around to her side, and opened her door. The rain hit my shoulders all at once. We walked across the wet grass to the steps. The porch light was on, warm and yellow, cutting a wedge out of all that dark. Grace stepped up onto the threshold, put her hand on the door frame, and turned around to look at me. Her hair was soaked flat against her face, rain running down her neck. I stood 1 step below her, close enough to see the porch light in her eyes, far enough that I still had a reason to move. "Come inside." She didn't say it any louder than the rain, but I heard it clearer than anything anyone has ever said to me. I stepped up onto the porch. "My name is Luke Brennan. I'm 30 years old, and I run a small general contracting outfit in Savannah, Georgia. I live alone in a rented duplex a few blocks off River Street. No wife, no kids, 4 guys on my crew, and we take the jobs the bigger companies don't bother returning calls about. Roof repairs, subfloor replacements, porches that have been sagging since the Clinton administration. I'm good with my hands and slow with my mouth, and in this business that combination gets you further than people think. My life is simple in a way that would probably bore most people. Up at 5:30, coffee standing at the counter. Drive the truck out to whatever house we're working on, spend 9 or 10 hours in the heat, come home, shower off the sawdust, eat dinner by myself, sleep, repeat. I'm not complaining about it. I chose it. There's a particular kind of peace in knowing exactly what your day is going to ask of you. 2 years before that night in the rain, I met Jess Maddox in a bar on Congress Street. She was 22. She talked fast, laughed loud, and filled a room the second she walked into it. Everything with her was content. Every dinner, every drive out to Tybee, every Saturday morning, she'd hold the phone up and say something, and I'd say something, and it would be up on her feed before the food came. I was the boyfriend on the feed. I didn't love being filmed, but I liked Jess. Or I thought I did. At 30, it's hard to tell the difference between liking someone and liking that someone chose you. 3 months in, she took me to meet her mother. The house was a craftsman on a street where the live oaks grow all the way across and meet in the middle, out past the edge of town where Savannah stops being tourists and starts being people. Grace Maddox opened the door. She was 44 then. She shook my hand and told me she'd heard a lot about me, which I doubted, and she had garden dirt under her fingernails, which I didn't. The back fence had gone over in a storm. 2 sections leaning into the neighbor's azaleas. I offered to fix it. She said no. I offered again the next time, and she said no again, politely. The way people do when they've decided that accepting help is a debt. The 3rd time I just showed up with my tools on a Saturday morning and started pulling posts. She didn't argue. She went inside and came back 20 minutes later with coffee. The mug was pale green ceramic with a chip in the rim. I remember that because she handed me that one specifically and set her own down on the step, and it was a different mug entirely. I didn't think about it. I drank the coffee, and I set the posts, and she sat on the back steps while I worked and didn't fill the silence with anything. That was the thing about Grace. She was quiet, not shy, not cold, just economical. When Jess was inside recording something in the living room, doing that voice she used for the camera, the one pitched about an octave above her real one, Grace would be out back with the hose, watering. I'd catch her sometimes standing in front of a flower bed, not doing anything at all, just standing there a long time, like she was in the middle of a conversation with somebody who wasn't there. I didn't know her husband's name. I didn't know whose mug that was. I didn't know most of what was in that house, and most of that was because I never asked. You don't interrogate your girlfriend's mother. You fix her fence, you drink her coffee, and you go home. Here's the part I've thought about more than anything else in the last 2 years. It was an afternoon in April, my first spring going out there. I was up on a ladder replacing a rotted support post under the porch overhang, and the sky did what Savannah skies do, which is open up without asking. I had maybe another 20 minutes of work and no intention of stopping. Grace went inside. She came back out with a jacket, heavy canvas, old. Work coat, the kind you buy once and then own for the rest of your life. She didn't say anything about it. She just came up behind me while I was on that ladder and put it over my shoulders and went back in the house. I finished the post. I wore the jacket home. I forgot to give it back. The next weekend I brought it with me, folded on the passenger seat, and held it out to her at the door. She looked at it for a second longer than she needed to. "Keep it," she said. "Nobody wears it anymore." 6 words. It took me more than a year to understand how much they weighed. I kept that jacket. It became my raincoat, my cold morning coat, the thing that lived behind the seat of my truck. It smelled like sawdust and machine oil, and the cuffs were worn soft in a way that new canvas never is, and when you put it on, it had weight to it, like somebody setting a hand on your shoulder. There was one more piece of furniture in that world, and his name was Earl Hodges. Earl was 63, lived on the other side of the fence, and had been on that street since before Grace was on it. He was always out there when I pulled up, sitting on his own porch with a jar of tea, or moving a hose around his tomatoes, or doing that thing older men do where they inspect something in their yard that doesn't need inspecting. Every single time I came, he'd look up and nod at me. Every single time I left, he'd nod again. He never said a word to me for the first 1.5 years. I thought he was just a quiet neighbor. I've since learned that Earl talks plenty. He just doesn't say things until he's decided they're worth saying, and back then he hadn't decided yet. The second year with Jess was when the comparisons started. It was never direct. It was always a story about somebody else. A coworker in Atlanta who'd been promoted twice in a year. A guy from college who'd raised money for an app. She'd tell me about them at dinner, and then she'd look at me across the table with this careful, patient expression, waiting for me to hear the point. "I need somebody with direction, Luke," she said one night. Just like that. Like she was reading me a weather report. I said I had direction. I said the direction was Savannah, and a crew of 4, and a business I'd built out of a used truck and a borrowed miter saw. She said that wasn't what she meant, and she was right, and I knew she was right, and neither one of us said anything else about it for a month. Through all of that, I kept going out to her mother's house, every 2 or 3 weeks. Jess never came with me anymore, and after a while she stopped asking where I was going. Grace would call or text, and it was always something small. The kitchen faucet was dripping again. The lock on the garden shed was sticking. The porch light was flickering. Every time, the same shape to the visit. I'd fix the thing. It'd take 20 minutes. Then she'd bring out coffee in that pale green mug with the chipped rim, and we'd sit on the back steps, and we'd talk about nothing in particular. Whether the tomatoes were going to make it, what kind of wood I was using on whatever job I was on that week. She knew more about wood than I expected her to, and when I asked her how, she said her husband used to work with it, and then she asked me a question about something else, and that was the end of that. Here's what I want you to notice, because you'll notice it before I did. The kitchen faucet I'd rebuilt 3 months earlier was dripping again. The shed lock I'd already replaced the whole cylinder on was sticking again. The porch light I'd rewired was flickering again. Everything I fixed at that house came unfixed, not right away. 2 months, 3 months. Long enough that it never once occurred to me to be suspicious, and just often enough that there was always something. What I told myself, on the rare occasion I thought about it, was that Grace lived alone in an old house, and everything in it was tired. That's true of a lot of houses in Savannah. Salt air chews through hardware, wood swells, gaskets go brittle. I have made a living off the fact that old houses fall apart faster than people expect, and she never made a production of it. She'd text one line. Faucet's dripping again. Sorry. Always the sorry. I'd say no problem and put her on the schedule for Saturday. I never charged her, and she never offered, and that felt like an agreement we'd made without discussing it. I remember one afternoon, carrying my tool bag back out to the truck, and Earl was over the fence with his hose. "You're a hard worker," he said. It was the first full sentence he'd ever said to me. That house sure does keep needing things. His voice was completely neutral. His eyes weren't. I said something like old houses, and he nodded and went back to his tomatoes, and I drove home and didn't think about it again for a year. In May of that second year, Jess ended it. She did it over a video call from Atlanta. She'd taken a marketing job up there 2 weeks earlier and had already found an apartment. I could see it behind her while she talked. White furniture, bare walls, a ring light off to the side throwing a little halo onto the window glass. "I need more than this, Luke," she said. "I'm sorry. I didn't fight her on it. I didn't ask her to reconsider. I didn't make a case for myself. I didn't say any of the things you're supposed to say, partly because I'm not built that way, and partly because somewhere in the last 6 months I'd stopped being surprised. I said okay. I said I hoped Atlanta was good to her." She said thanks, and the call ended, and the screen went back to my home screen with a picture of a job site on it. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that, not doing anything. The house was quiet in the way a rented duplex is quiet, which is to say it isn't. There's just other people's quiet coming through the wall. That canvas jacket was hanging off the back of the chair across from me. I remember looking at it and thinking, well, that's over too. I didn't call Grace. The reasoning was simple, and I never once questioned it. She was the mother of the woman who had just left me. What was I going to call her for? To fix a faucet? To sit on her back steps and drink coffee out of a chipped green mug like nothing had happened? How would that look? To her, to Jess, to Earl over the fence with his hose. There was no version of that call I could picture without wincing. The jacket stayed with me. I kept wearing it because it was February, and then it was March, and it was the warmest thing I owned. Every so often, I'd think about returning it. I'd get as far as imagining the drive out there, and then I'd hit the part where I'm standing on her porch holding a folded coat, and I'd realize I had no idea what I would say. There was no script for that conversation. "Hi, here's your dead husband's jacket. Sorry about your daughter. Take care." So, I didn't. What I felt in those months wasn't heartbreak. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to how the rest of this goes. Jess, leaving, didn't take the ground out from under me. What I felt was smaller and stranger. It was the feeling of a routine ending. 2 years of Saturdays, with a shape to them, and then no shape. And underneath that, way down where I wasn't looking, something I didn't have a name for yet. A specific absence. Not the loud one, the quiet one. Summer went by. I took on more work than I needed, which is a thing men do instead of talking to anybody. I turned down 2 invitations to go out. I didn't download anything, didn't sit at any bars, didn't do the thing where you make yourself available. Fall came, and Savannah went from unbearable to almost pleasant, and I hung a whole new porch on a house in Ardsley Park and never once drove past that street with the oaks, except in October, when I did. It was on the way to a job, and it was faster, and I told myself that was why. Her porch light was on, in the middle of the day. I didn't stop, but I looked at it longer than I needed to. 6 months isn't a long time. But when you're spending real effort not thinking about somebody, every week runs like a month. Then, it was November, and it was a Thursday, and I was at the hardware store on Abercorn around 7 in the evening picking up deck screws for a job that started Friday. I came out, and it was coming down in sheets, and she was standing under the overhang with a paper bag in one arm. She'd walked. Her house is about 2 miles from that store, and she'd walked it, because that's the kind of thing she does, and the sky had been gray but not threatening when she left. I pulled up and rolled the window down. "Get in. I'll drive you home." I said it in a completely ordinary voice, like 6 months hadn't happened, like I'd seen her the week before. She got in. She said thank you, and then she didn't say anything else, and I didn't either. 10 minutes across town in the dark and the rain. She looked out her window. I looked at the road, and the strange thing, the thing I noticed even then, was that the silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't the silence of two people who have something to get through. It was the same silence as those afternoons on the back steps, when I was working and she was sitting there with a book she wasn't reading, comfortable, worn in. At her house, I shut the engine off, went around, and opened her door. And we walked up through the wet grass together, and the rain came down on both of us. The porch light was on. She stepped up onto the threshold, put her hand on the frame, and turned around. "Come inside." I went inside. Nothing in that house had changed. The heart pine floors that creak in the same 3 places, the bookshelf by the window with the plants crowding the bottom shelf, that green smell of a house where somebody grows things, dirt and leaf and water. She made coffee and put it in front of me in the pale green mug and didn't say a word about it. We sat at her kitchen table until almost 2 in the morning. We didn't talk about Jess. Not once. We didn't talk about the 6 months, or the breakup, or any of it. She asked about the porch I'd built in Ardsley Park and made me describe the railing. I asked how the nursery was doing, and she told me about a shipment of Japanese maples that had come in half dead and how she'd nursed most of them back. I told her about a subcontractor who'd cost me a week. She laughed at a thing I said, which she almost never did out loud. Twice she got up to refill the pot. Once she stood at the counter with her back to me a while, doing nothing that needed doing, and then came back and asked me another question about the railing. It was like the 6 months had been a long nap. When I finally stood up to go, I stopped in the hall by the front door. There was a canvas jacket hanging on the hook. Same hook, same spot by the door. Heavy work canvas, worn soft at the cuffs, and I was wearing mine. The one she'd handed me on a ladder more than a year and a half before, the one she'd told me to keep because nobody wore it anymore. I must have stood there a beat too long, because she came into the hall behind me. "That one was Tom's," she said. "Perfectly level." I took it back out of the closet. I said something. "Good night. Thank you for the coffee. Drive safe." One of those. I got in my truck and I drove home through the last of the rain. And about halfway back I thought, hold on. If Tom's jacket was in the closet, then the one on my back, the one she put over my shoulders in April, the one she told me nobody wears anymore, which one was that? I didn't call her to ask. It would have been a strange question and I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. But I thought about it the rest of the night. 4 days later, she called about the hinge on the garden shed. I drove out. It took 15 minutes. A hinge pin had worked its way half out, and the door was dragging and squealing on the concrete, and I tapped the pin back down, hit both hinges with penetrating oil, and swung the door 6 times to be sure. Then, I sat on her back steps and drank coffee for 2 hours. The week after that, it was a loose board on the front porch, 20 minutes to pull it and put in a new one and drive the nails home. 3 hours on the steps afterward. The week after that, she didn't bother with a reason. "I made soup," she said on the phone. "It's too much for one person. I got there at 6. I left at 10. You can see the shape of it." I could see the shape of it too, even then. Even if I wouldn't have said it out loud to anybody. The repairs kept getting smaller, and the visits kept getting longer, and then the repairs stopped being the point at all, and I kept coming anyway. We didn't touch. I want to be clear about that. Not a hand on an arm, not a hug at the door, Nothing. There was no flirting. I never said a single thing to that woman I couldn't have said in front of a room full of people. All we did was spend time. She'd tell me about the nursery, about the wholesale grower in Statesboro who kept shorting her orders, about how she'd started carrying more natives because people were finally asking for them. I'd tell her about the crew, about Danny, my framer, who's the best I've ever worked with and cannot be relied on to show up before 9, about the parts of the job that are just arithmetic and the parts that are guessing. Nobody named what was happening. There wasn't a word available that either one of us was willing to use. And every single time, I left later than the time before. Earl started seeing my truck in front of that house after dark, not once. Regularly, 3-4 nights out of a month, through December and January and into February. I passed him one evening on my way to my truck, and he was out on his own steps with a jar of tea, and he said, without any preamble at all, "Tom used to sit in that chair. That's the whole thing," he said. He didn't explain it. And I stood in the dark on the sidewalk and understood, all at once, that for 2 months I had been sitting on that back porch in a wooden chair with a worn spot on the left arm at a table set for 2, and that the chair had belonged to Grace's husband. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel about that. I still don't, entirely. I remember driving home with the heater on and my hands at 10 and 2, running it over, whether it was a warning or a welcome, whether Earl was telling me to be careful or telling me it was all right. What I did instead of thinking about it was get up the next morning at 5:30 and go to work, which is what I do instead of thinking about most things. In March, Jess lost her job. The Atlanta company restructured and cut about a third of the marketing department, and she was 10 months in and not senior enough to survive it. She gave up the apartment with the white furniture and came home to Savannah, and she moved back into her old bedroom in her mother's house. I found out from Grace, not from Jess. 10 months, and Jess and I hadn't traded a single message. That's how completely a 2-year relationship can close over when nobody involved is willing to be dramatic about it. Grace called me. Her voice was different, a half-step faster than usual, a little tight around the edges. "Jess is home for a while," she said. "So maybe this week you don't need to come out." I said, "Sure, of course. Take care of your girl." And I heard the pause on the other end. Not long. Maybe a second and a half. The kind of pause where a person decides not to say the next thing. The first week I didn't come. The second week, I got a text. Porch lights burned out. 3 words. Now. I had replaced that fixture and put a new bulb in it 2 months before. It was an LED. Rated at 15 years. I looked at that text for a long time, sitting in my truck outside a job site in Thunderbolt. Here's what I want to admit. I did the math. I knew what an LED bulb in a covered fixture is rated for, because knowing that is literally part of my job. I read those 3 words and some part of my brain said, that bulb is not burned out. And then I put my phone in my pocket and I drove out there that evening anyway. And I didn't examine why, because if you don't examine a thing, you don't have to decide what to do about it. Jess opened the door. She looked at me for a second like she was checking whether I was actually there. Luke? Not hostile. Genuinely surprised. She looked older than 10 months should have made her. "Mom said a bulb was out?" I said it was. I went up the ladder and took the fixture cover off, and the bulb was fine. It had backed a quarter turn out of the socket, which doesn't happen on its own to a fixture that hasn't been touched. I seated it. It came on. I put the cover back and came down the ladder and folded it up. Grace stayed in the kitchen the whole time. Never came out. I could see the shape of her at the counter through the window over the sink. I was there 10 minutes, no coffee. But going down the porch steps with the ladder over my shoulder, through the screen door, I heard Jess say to her mother, "The jacket on the hook. That's Luke's, right?" I didn't hear what Grace said. I put the ladder in the truck and drove off. 2 weeks after that, Jess called me. Her voice was light, friendly, warm, even. It's a specific voice, and if you've ever known somebody like Jess, you know it, because it's the one they use when they want something, and they haven't decided yet how they're going to ask for it. Can we get lunch? I think we should talk. I said yes, because I assumed she wanted closure, and because I thought I owed her that. I was wrong about what she wanted. We met at a place on Bull Street with sidewalk tables. She got there first. She ordered a salad and didn't touch it, and she had her phone face down next to her hand the whole time, which for Jess is roughly the equivalent of another person standing up and locking the door. How long have you been going over to my mother's house? I told her the truth. A few months, fixing things, coffee. She smiled with one side of her mouth. Fixing things? Okay. She let that sit. She'd gotten good at that in Atlanta, or maybe she'd always been good at it and I'd just never been on this side of it. Then she laid it out. She'd been in her mother's phone. Not snooping, she said, which is what people say when they've been snooping. The phone was on the counter and it lit up, and she'd scrolled, and there was nothing in there. That's the part she kept circling back to. Nothing romantic, nothing improper, nothing you couldn't read out loud at a church picnic. Soup tonight? Is that porch board dry yet? Thanks for tonight. But it's 3-4 times a week, she said. For 4 months, Luke, 4 months. She leaned in. I know my mother. She doesn't text anybody 3 times a week. She doesn't text me 3 times a week. She doesn't make soup for people. I didn't say anything. I've thought a lot about why I didn't say anything at that table. Whether it was because I had no defense, or because I hadn't done anything that needed defending, or because somewhere in my chest I already knew she was right about the only part that actually mattered. 2 weeks later, she posted. It was long. Instagram, a wall of text over a photo of nothing in particular. She didn't use names. She didn't have to. Savannah is a real city, but the part of it that knows the Maddox family is about 400 people wide. When your own mother develops feelings for your boyfriend while you're still dating him, and then the second you break up, she's got him coming over to the house every night. That was the center of it. There was more, and it was worse in the way that things are worse when they're carefully phrased. My phone did a thing that day it had never done before, which is go quiet in a way you can feel. 2 guys on my crew stopped asking me about my weekend. A supplier I've used for 6 years got a little formal on the phone. Nobody said anything to my face. In a place like this, nobody ever says anything to your face. It moved fast, not viral like a stranger goes viral. Viral the way it happens in a place where everybody's mother knows everybody's mother. And because Jess wrote it first, Jess got to decide what it was about. That's the part people don't understand about a story like this. The first version out of the gate isn't the true one. It's just the one everybody hears while their opinion is still soft. She called her Aunt Ruth, Grace's younger sister, out in Pooler. Ruth called Grace that same night, and I know what she said because Grace told me later, in the flat voice she uses for things she's decided not to feel in front of anybody. Is it true? Your daughter breaks up with him, and you invite him into your house? Grace didn't defend herself. She didn't explain the faucet, or the soup, or 2 years of sitting on a back step with a man she never touched. She said, I don't owe you that answer, which is, if you know Grace, about as close to a shout as she gets. Ruth hasn't called her since, and that same week, Jess came into the nursery. Middle of a Saturday. Maddox Garden is a long, low building off Waters with the retail side up front and the greenhouses behind, and on a Saturday in April there are people in there, 3 or 4 customers at the counter, a kid working the register. Jess walked in and stood in the middle of the floor and said it loud enough for the whole room. You want to say something about you and Luke, or do you want me to say it? Grace was at the workbench behind the counter, cutting stems. She set the shears down on the wood. That's the sound I keep hearing when I picture it, and I wasn't even there. Steel on a hardwood bench, dry, final. She looked at her daughter. She didn't say a word. You liked him while I was dating him, Jess said. Every time you called him over to fix something, you knew the faucet wasn't broken. You knew. The customers stood there. Nobody moved. There is a specific silence that happens when strangers realize they are watching something they have no business watching, and it filled that room to the ceiling. One woman put down what she was holding and walked out without buying it. Grace didn't answer. She put both hands flat on the bench and left them there. I wasn't there for any of it. Earl was. He'd come in for a bag of lime and was standing one aisle over by the seed rack, and he told me about it 2 days later on his own front steps, the same evening he told me the rest of what he'd been sitting on for 2 years. She put her hands down flat on that bench, Earl said, like she was holding it down so it wouldn't blow away. He turned his jar of tea around in his hands and looked at the street for a while before he said the rest of it. She never looked up. But she never looked away, either. I drove out there that same night, straight from Earl's steps. The porch light was off. I had been coming to that house for 3 years. I had come in daylight and after dark, in August and in January, when the family liked me and after they didn't, and I had never one time seen that porch light off. I sat in the truck for a minute, looking at a dark porch, and then I got out and knocked. Grace opened the door. She looked exactly like she always looks. There was nothing on her face to read at all. The only difference was the quiet, which was thicker than usual, like the air before weather. I didn't work up to it, I said. Jess says you knew the faucet wasn't broken, that the porch light wasn't out. Is that true? She stepped back to let me in, and she went and sat down in a kitchen chair, and she was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I heard the refrigerator cycle on. Then she said, in a completely even voice, without 1 ounce of defense in it, "Yes, most of it." And then she told me all of it, start to finish, without stopping and without being asked a second question, the way a person does when they've been rehearsing something for 2 years in a house with nobody in it. It started, she thought, sometime in the first year I was dating her daughter. Not as anything. Not as a thought she'd have recognized if you'd handed it to her. It started as liking that somebody was in the yard, then as liking the conversation, then as noticing that she'd started listening for a truck on Saturday mornings. She said what got her was the way I worked, that I did things slowly and got them right the first time. That when I didn't know something, I said so and went and figured it out and came back. That I didn't fill up the silences. She said she had spent 4 years being the only person in a house that used to have 2 people in it, and that most people, when they come into a house like that, talk constantly because silence makes them nervous. And that I never did. By the 2nd year I knew what it was, she said, and I want to be very clear with you about what I did with it. Nothing. She never acted on it. She never touched me. She never said a word to me, or to Jess, or to anybody. When Jess and I were together, she was cordial and useful and nothing else, and she meant to keep being that until it went away on its own, which she assumed it would, because she was 45 years old and not a fool. But I found reasons for you to come, she said. I want to say that out loud because it's the true part. I found reasons, and I don't know what to call that except what it is. I asked her why she never said anything after the breakup. 6 months, I said. You had 6 months where I wasn't dating anybody's daughter, she said, and this is close to word for word. And what would that have looked like? Your girlfriend leaves you and her mother calls you up 2 weeks later. There was no version of that phone call I could make, which is exactly the sentence I had been saying to myself, in my kitchen, alone, for half a year. I asked her about the faucet. She said she never broke anything. That mattered to her, apparently, that line. She never took a wrench to a thing I'd repaired. But a hinge pin can be tapped up with the heel of your hand. A bulb can be turned a quarter of the way out of a socket. A cabinet door that's been sticking a little can be left alone until it sticks a lot, and then reported. Small things, she said. That was the deal I made with myself. Nothing that would cost you real work, nothing that would cost you money. Just enough to have a reason. Then I asked about the jacket, and that's when I found out. The jacket she put over my shoulders on that ladder in April was Tom's. His actual coat, the one he had worn for 15 years, the one that had been hanging on the hook by the front door since March of 2019 because she could not make herself move it. She hadn't planned it. It was raining, I was on a ladder, and it was the coat that was there. And then I wore it home, and I didn't bring it back for a week, and when I finally did, she looked at it in my hands and told me to keep it. She said she didn't fully understand why in the moment, but afterward she went to a workwear store out on the south side and bought a canvas jacket as close to the same as she could find, washed it 8 or 9 times to knock the stiffness out of it, hung it on the hook by the front door, so the hook wouldn't be empty. I couldn't have it empty, she said. I'd already lived with it empty and I wasn't doing it again. When Jess and I broke up, and I stopped coming, she went out to the shed one afternoon and stood there for a while and then took the new one down off the hook and put it in the hall closet because at that point it was a coat that belonged to nobody and she couldn't look at it. And then in November it rained and I drove her home and she said come inside and I sat at her kitchen table until 2 in the morning like the last 6 months had never happened. And the next day she took Tom's coat out of the closet and hung it back on the hook, which is what I saw, which is what she told me the truth about, standing in that hall, in the flattest voice in the world. That one was Tom's. I took it back out of the closet. That hook has not been empty in 7 years. There has always been a coat on it. Either his, or one that stood in for him, or one connected to me. She looked at me across her kitchen table and said, I'm not proud of any of this, Luke, but I'm not going to apologize for it either. I went out to my truck and I drove home and I didn't say anything else that night. 3 days. I worked. I framed a deck in Georgetown in 92-degree heat and said maybe 15 words to my crew. I came home and showered and sat at my kitchen table and looked at a canvas jacket hanging on the back of a chair, which I now knew was not the one I'd thought it was, and had never been. Here's the question I was actually working on, not the one everybody else was working on. Everybody else, Jess and Ruth, and the 400 people in this town who care about the Maddox family, was asking whether Grace had done something wrong. And I understood the case. A woman had feelings for her daughter's boyfriend. Say it in one sentence like that, and it sounds ugly. But I kept running into the same wall, which was, she didn't do anything. For 2 years, with the thing sitting right there in her chest, she did nothing. She didn't flirt. She didn't undermine us. She didn't say one word to Jess against me, or one word to me against Jess. She let her daughter have the relationship, and she took the hardest possible version of the situation and just carried it, quietly, alone, in a house she already lived in alone. The only thing she ever took for herself was a broken faucet. So, the question I actually had was this. Does the fact that it started too early, in the wrong place, with the wrong person, make what's happening now wrong? Or does it just make it true? I thought about Jess. Jess left me because I didn't have direction. Grace called me over because of the way I take my time on things and don't rush and don't talk while I'm working. That's the same man. That is 100% the same set of facts. 2 people looked at the exact same thing, and one of them saw a dead end, and the other one saw somebody worth inventing reasons for. And I thought about Tom. That's the part that took the most time. Because she put his coat on me, and I couldn't decide whether that was a betrayal of him or the opposite of one, whether a woman who takes her dead husband's jacket off the hook and puts it on the shoulders of a younger man is letting go of something or handing something over. I still can't answer it cleanly, but I know that a person who was trying to erase her husband doesn't spend 4 years unable to move his. What I settled on, sitting at that table on the 3rd night, wasn't an answer to the question. It was smaller than that. It was just a fact I couldn't get around. In 3 years, the only person who had ever made me feel like the man I actually am was worth building a Saturday around was her. Day 3, I drove out to the nursery around closing. She was out front with a push broom, sweeping oak leaves off the concrete apron by the door. The lights inside were already half down. I got out of the truck. I didn't say I love you. I didn't say anything about what she'd told me or about Jess, or about the post, or about her sister, or about the two of us. I said, "Your porch light's been off the last few nights." She stopped sweeping and looked at me. "Yes," she said. "I can fix that." She didn't smile. Grace almost never does. Not the way other people mean it. But she stood there for a second, and then she leaned the broom against the wall, and she turned and walked into the store and left the door open behind her. I followed her in. That was not a declaration of love. It was a commitment. In the only language the two of us have ever been fluent in, you find the thing that's broken. You fix it. And then, you don't leave. That night I went out to the house and put a new bulb in the porch fixture, not because the old one was bad, because the old one had a story on it now, and I wanted a clean one. Grace stood in the doorway while I did it. I came down the ladder and hit the switch, and the light came on and threw that warm yellow wedge back out across the boards, exactly the way it had the first night in the rain. She said, "Thank you." Same 2 words as that night. Completely different voice. That one wasn't hiding anything. Everybody found out. Of course they did. Jess made sure of the first half, and the town handled the second half on its own. 2 of Ruth's friends stopped speaking to Grace entirely. 2 regular customers moved their business to the garden center out on the highway, which I know because Grace mentioned it once, in the same tone she'd use for a shipment arriving late. But here's the thing nobody tells you about a scandal in a small place. It is enormous for about 3 weeks, and then people have their own lives to get back to. The post stopped circulating. The conversations moved on to somebody else's family. It turns out most people are not nearly as interested in your business as the one person who wants them to be. Jess called me one more time. "You know what people think about you, right?" she said. "About the 2 of you?" I said. "Yeah." She waited for me to say more, to argue, or apologize, or defend her mother, or defend myself. I didn't say anything. A few seconds of silence, and then she hung up. That was the last time we ever spoke. We didn't rush anything. We didn't announce anything either. No posts. Nobody was going to get a photo of us out of this. We never even sat down and put a name on what we were, which I think would strike a lot of people as strange, and which felt, to both of us, like the only honest thing available. What happened instead was dinner. 3, 4 nights a week, at her kitchen table, and I started fixing things again, except now it was the real list, the one she'd been sitting on. The back corner of the garden shed had gone soft where the downspout had been dumping against it for 6 years, and I tore out about 8 feet of sill and sistered in new framing. The front steps had settled and pitched a good 1.5 inches toward the yard, and I jacked them, reset them, and shimmed the stringers. She'd been living with those real problems, the kind you don't call somebody about, because calling somebody about a real problem means admitting you can't handle it, and a woman who has been alone in a house for 6 years does not enjoy admitting that. The small stuff, the invented stuff, stopped completely. That was how I knew we were somewhere new. There's something worth saying about doing that work. When I was fixing invented problems, I was a guest with a wrench. When I tore out that sill plate and put a real shed back under her, I was something else. She stood out there and handed me framing nails and asked questions about load paths that were better questions than most of my clients ask. And at some point in the middle of a Saturday I realized I wasn't visiting, I was maintaining. Meanwhile, she opened the nursery every morning at 8 and I was on a job site by 7, and the actual shape of our lives didn't change at all. Same alarms, same trucks, same work. All that changed was who was in it. The first time I held her hand was in June, walking through Forsyth Park. We'd gone downtown for no reason. She wanted to look at somebody's garden beds on Whitaker, and we ended up walking the long way back. It was evening, still hot, the light coming sideways through the moss. I moved my hand over. She took it. Neither one of us said anything. Neither one of us looked at the other one. We just kept walking, exactly the same pace as before, all the way to the north end of the park and out onto Bull Street, and I don't think either one of us breathed properly for about a block and a half. What I remember is how ordinary it was. I had spent weeks assuming that if it ever happened it would be a moment, with a before and an after and something said out loud. It was a hand. It was a park. It was the two of us continuing to walk. The first time she used my first name in front of Earl was a Saturday in July. I was rehanging the gate on the side fence, and she came out with 2 glasses of water and said, "Luke, drink something." Earl looked up from his tomatoes. And he nodded the way he'd nodded 100 times. But this time there was a smile with it. Small. About a quarter of one, but it was there, and it was the first one I ever got out of him. We went slow on everything. Slower than 2 people our age needed to, probably, but we'd both watched what happens when a thing gets announced before it's built, and neither one of us was in a hurry to prove anything to anybody who'd already made up their mind about us. The town got used to us. Slower than I wanted and faster than I expected. Not everybody. There are people at her church who have never come all the way back around, and there's a woman who runs a shop on Abercorn who I know for a fact has opinions, but the resistance never assembled itself into a wall. It stayed what it was, a low buzz around the edges of things. You hear it, it doesn't stop the summer. Grace and I have still, to this day, never said I love you to each other. What we say is the coffee up? And, let me take a look at that. And, I made too much soup for one person. It means the same thing. I'd argue it means more, because those sentences cost something to follow through on, and the other one doesn't. By the fall of that year, I was leaving things at her house. It happened the way water gets into a basement. No decision, no announcement, just accumulation. A toolbox in the shed, because I was working on the shed. Then a pair of work boots by the back door, because it was stupid to keep carrying them back and forth. Then a toothbrush in the downstairs bathroom. Grace never commented on any of it. She just made room. A drawer got empty. Half a closet rod got empty. Neither of us ever said one word about either of those things. I still had the duplex. On paper, I still lived there, and I still paid rent on it, and my mail still went there, and about once a week I'd stop in and stand in the middle of a living room with a couch and a television in it, and feel like I was walking through a house I'd finished for somebody else. But every morning I was making coffee in her kitchen, sitting at her table, looking out her window at her garden. There was one thing from that fall I think about more than the rest of it. She switched to pre-ground coffee. She'd always ground her own, every morning, in a little burr grinder on the counter. And then sometime in October there was a bag of pre-ground on the shelf instead, and the grinder had moved to the back of the cabinet. She never said anything about it. She didn't mention it once, and she wouldn't have, not if I'd lived there 10 years. I get up at 5:30. She gets up at 7. That grinder is loud, and her bedroom is directly above the kitchen. I noticed the new bag on the shelf and stood there in her kitchen at 5:45 in the morning holding it, and I got it, and I never brought it up either. We were past the part where things needed to be explained out loud. Also, that fall, Tom's coat went into the closet. She did it herself, without discussing it. The hook by the front door had my work jacket on it, and one day his wasn't underneath it anymore. Neither of us mentioned that either. In October, Jess moved to Dallas. She'd found something in real estate marketing, which suits her. And she'd been in her mother's house for 7 months, and by the end of it, the two of them were passing each other in the hallway like co-workers at a company neither of them liked. Before she left, she came by the nursery one last time. I wasn't there. Grace told me about it that night at the table. Jess didn't apologize. Grace didn't either. Whatever picture you have in your head of 2 women finally saying the true things to each other, you can throw it out. What Jess said was, "I don't understand it, but I'm tired." And what Grace said was, "I know." That was the whole thing. Grace said it took about 90 seconds, standing between the register and the door, and then Jess said she'd text when she got there, and left and drove to Texas. That's not reconciliation. That's a ceasefire, And it happened because both of them ran out of energy, not because anybody forgave anybody. But I've come to think a ceasefire is worth a great deal. Nobody is shooting. Sometimes that's all that's available in the first year, and you take it, and you see what the second year does. She took the post down. Quietly, no follow-up, no explanation, just gone 1 week. I only knew because a guy on my crew mentioned it, in the careful voice people had been using around me since April. She didn't apologize for it, she just stopped saying it, and I've decided that's worth something. Because taking it down is the only kind of apology some people have in them, and if you refuse to accept the one they've got, you'll be waiting the rest of your life for one they don't. In December, Grace got a text from her. A photo of an apartment in Dallas. Bare walls, boxes, a window with bad light. No caption at all. Grace looked at it for a while and then sent back a single heart, one emoji. That was the entire exchange. But it was the first thing either of them had sent the other in 2 months, and it went in the right direction. I stayed out of all of it. Completely. It was not my place, and it will never be my place, and the one useful thing I could contribute to a mother and daughter working out what they are to each other was to not be a factor in the room. The only thing I did, the whole time, was not disappear. That's the year, more or less. Here's where it ended up. It's the summer of 2026 now. I let the duplex go last winter. I live at that house, officially, if official means every single thing I own is there, and every morning she sets the pale green mug down next to my white one without either of us saying anything about it. Maddox's garden expanded. She took the storage bay on the east end and turned it into a section for cedar and cypress. Planters, trellises, raised bed kits. I built the display racks and the counter, and my crew has done 2 jobs for her since, and I still don't charge her, and she still doesn't offer. Earl comes over for coffee on Sunday afternoons. He sits in the porch chair, the one with the worn spot on the left arm, and he tells me about Tom, not to remind me that I'm not him. I want to be clear, because I know how it sounds. Earl has never once in 2 years made me feel like a substitute for anybody. He tells me about Tom because he knew the man for 11 years, and he liked him, and he doesn't have many people left who want to hear about him. And I do want to hear about him. So he talks and I listen, and Grace comes out and sits on the step and listens too. Last Sunday, he told me about the time Tom tried to move a chest freezer up those porch steps by himself and put a gouge in the second riser you can still find if you know where to look. I've had my hand on that gouge 50 times and never once wondered about it. And the coats, sometime this spring, Grace got Tom's jacket out of the closet and hung it back up by the front door on a second hook next to my Carhartt. She didn't say anything about that either. I came in one evening and there were 2 coats where there used to be one, an old one and a new one, hanging next to each other like 2 men who have known each other a long time. It's Sunday morning as I'm telling you this, and I'm sitting on the front porch of a house on a street where the oaks meet in the middle. My house. Coffee in a pale green mug with a chip in the rim, my Carhartt on the hook inside the door, and Tom's canvas jacket on the hook next to it. I think about that night in the rain more than I probably should. She said, "Come inside," and I thought she meant get out of the weather. That's what I heard. A woman being decent to a man who'd given her a ride. I know now what she was actually doing. She was inviting me into her life. She had been carrying those 2 words for 2 years, and she waited until it was pouring rain on a dark street where there was nobody within 100 yards to hear her say them. I'm not a remarkable man. I'm not wealthy. I'm not important. I don't have the direction that Jess wanted, and I'm never going to. What I've got is that I can fix a faucet. I can put a bulb in a porch light. I can show up on a Saturday and take my time and get it right. Some weeks, I think that's not much. And then I remember that it was enough for the only person whose opinion I'm still checking. Here's what Grace taught me, and I don't think I could have learned it any other way. Love doesn't always start when it's supposed to. Sometimes it starts too early, in the wrong house, with the wrong person, at the exact worst possible time, and when it does, you don't get to announce it. you put it away. You call it something else. You call it a dripping faucet, or a porch light that's burned out, or too much soup for one person. And you wait. And most people wait forever, and nothing ever comes of it, and they die with it folded up. But every once in a while, if you are very, very lucky, the other person finally knocks. I asked her once whether she thought Tom would mind. We were on the back steps. She looked out at the garden for a long time, long enough that I thought maybe I shouldn't have asked. Then she said, "Tom would have liked you. You fix things exactly the way he did. Slow, careful, and you never bring anybody's tools back." That is the best answer I have ever gotten to anything. The porch light at my house never goes off now. Not because I forget it, because Grace turns it on every evening, whether I'm out on a job or 10 feet away in the kitchen. She doesn't need to. She knows exactly where I am. It's an old habit. It comes from the years when she was leaving a light on for somebody and hadn't admitted to herself who. The green mug. I finally know the story on. Tom made it in a ceramics class in 2003. He chipped the rim himself, carrying it out to his truck 3 days after he brought it home. She's had it 23 years, and every morning she pours my coffee into it. Not because I remind her of him. I asked, and I got a look for asking. It's because she trusts me with it. The mug, and everything that comes attached to it. Earl said something to me last week. I'd brought the coffee out to the porch on a tray, and he took his and said, "Tom used to bring it out on that same tray." Then he took a sip, but Tom never put enough sugar in it, and I laughed. That was the first time I ever laughed about Tom Maddox. Not out of sadness, and not out of guilt, which is the thing I'd been braced for. I laughed because he was a real man who lived in this house, who built the shelf over that window, who put a gouge in the second riser, who drank out of this mug and got the sugar wrong. I'm not replacing him. I'm continuing something he started. Sometimes love doesn't knock. Sometimes it stands out in the rain and waits for you to say, "Come inside." So let me ask you 2 things before you go. If you found out that somebody had been quietly carrying a feeling for you for years and never once acted on it, would you find that beautiful? Or would it frighten you? And have you ever kept something that belonged to somebody else, not because you needed the thing, but because you needed to remember? If this story made you think about someone, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me down in the comments. What's your jacket?